The warrant had been folded and unfolded so many times that the parchment had gone soft as cloth, and Quinlan Kelter could trace every crease by memory alone as he crouched in the underbrush, watching smoke rise from the chimney of the isolated cabin nestled in the valley below. 3 months he had been tracking Grishka, the orc woman accused of murdering a human merchant on the northern trade road, and the trail had led him through 6 different territories, across 2 mountain ranges, and finally to this remote corner of the frontier, where civilization thinned to nothing but wind and wilderness. He had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways during the long nights sleeping rough under stars that offered no warmth, had rehearsed the capture, the binding, the long march back to collect his payment. But now that he had finally found her, something about the scene below made him hesitate. The cabin was small but well-maintained, its roof recently patched with fresh thatch. A vegetable garden spreading in neat rows beside it despite the late season. Chickens scratched in a fenced yard, and he could see a small barn that likely held a goat or 2. This was not the hideout of a killer on the run. This was a home, built with care and intention, settled with the kind of permanence that spoke of someone planning to stay. Quinlan shifted his weight, ignoring the protest of muscles that had grown stiff from 2 hours of motionless observation, and studied the figure that emerged from the cabin carrying a basket of washing. Even from this distance, there was no mistaking her for human. Grishka stood nearly a head taller than any woman he had ever known, her shoulders broad and her arms corded with muscle that flexed as she hung wet clothing on a line strung between 2 posts. Her skin was the deep green of summer forest shade, and when she turned her head to look out across the valley, he caught the glint of tusks jutting from her lower jaw. Her dark hair had been pulled back in a practical braid that hung to the middle of her back, and she wore simple frontier clothing, a rough-spun shirt and leather breeches that had seen hard use but were clean and mended. She moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to solitary labor, hanging each garment with quick, practiced motions, and Quinlan found himself noting details that had nothing to do with apprehending a fugitive. The way she paused to push a strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist, the small garden tools arranged neatly on a bench by the door, the way she tilted her face up to catch the afternoon sun for just a moment before returning to her task. These were not the actions of someone fleeing justice. These were the rhythms of an ordinary life, hard-won and carefully tended. He pulled the warrant from his coat pocket and unfolded it once more, though he had long since memorized every word. Grishka, no family name given, orc female, approximately 25 years of age, wanted for the murder of Tobias merchant on the northern trade road. Reward of 300 gold crowns for capture and return, alive preferred but dead acceptable. The description matched, down to the distinctive scar that curved along her left forearm, visible now as she reached up to hang a shirt. 300 gold crowns was enough to buy a small farm, enough to stop taking jobs that led him into the sort of places where civilized folk did not go, enough to finally rest. But something about the warrant had troubled him from the beginning, small inconsistencies that he had noted but dismissed in favor of the substantial payment. The merchant had supposedly been traveling alone, which was unusual for someone carrying goods valuable enough to murder for. The warrant had been issued not by the local magistrate but by a private party, the merchant's business partner, who had seemed more interested in speed than in questions when Quinlan had taken the contract. And most telling, in 3 months of tracking, he had found no evidence that Grishka had sold any stolen goods or suddenly come into money. The trail had been that of someone traveling light and living rough, taking odd work where she could find it, always moving on before questions could be asked. Quinlan had tracked enough fugitives to know the patterns of guilt, and this did not fit them. A killer fleeing a murder would run hard and fast, would disappear into a city or cross the ocean, would not settle in an isolated valley and plant a garden. But the warrant was legal, the signature and seal authentic, and he was a bounty hunter, not a judge. His job was to bring her in and collect his payment, not to question the justice of it. He watched as she finished with the washing and carried the empty basket back into the cabin, disappearing from view. This was the moment to move, to approach while she was inside and potentially unaware, to secure the situation before she could react. Quinlan rose from his crouch, every instinct honed by years of dangerous work telling him to advance, to complete the job he had spent 3 months pursuing. Instead, he remained at the edge of the clearing, hidden in the shadow of the trees, and wondered why his feet would not carry him forward. The sun was starting its descent toward the western peaks, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber, and smoke continued its lazy rise from the cabin chimney. Somewhere inside, Grishka was going about the business of her evening, unaware that the hunter who had pursued her across half the frontier was standing less than 100 yards away, unable to decide whether to finish what he had started. A sound from the cabin drew his attention, the creak of the door opening, and Grishka emerged again, this time carrying a bucket and heading toward the small barn. She walked with the easy confidence of someone who believed herself safe, who had no reason to fear the approach of strangers. As she passed through the door of the barn, Quinlan made his decision. He needed answers before he could proceed, needed to know whether the woman he had tracked for 3 months was truly a murderer or whether something else was happening here. He waited until she was occupied inside the barn, before moving from his concealment, crossing the open ground with the silence that had kept him alive through a dozen dangerous captures. The cabin door stood slightly ajar, and he slipped inside, taking in the single room with a glance that catalogued every detail. The space was spare but comfortable, a bed in one corner piled with handmade quilts, a table and 2 chairs by the hearth, shelves holding a modest collection of dishes and supplies. What caught his attention was the stack of papers on the table, weighted down with a smooth river stone. Quinlan crossed to the table and lifted the stone, scanning the top sheet with growing tension. It was a letter, written in a careful hand that suggested formal education, addressed to the territorial magistrate in a town 2 weeks' ride to the east. The content made his jaw tighten. Grishka was not merely living quietly in isolation. She was building a case, documenting everything she knew about the night Tobias Merchant had died, including details that had never appeared in the warrant. According to her account, she had been traveling the trade road when she came upon Merchant beating a young orc male, barely more than a boy, who had apparently tried to steal food from the merchant's wagon. Grishka had intervened, trying to stop the beating before it became a killing, and in the struggle that followed, Merchant had drawn a knife. She had defended herself, disarmed him, and in the process he had fallen, striking his head on the wheel of his own wagon. She had fled, knowing that no human authority would believe an orc's word over a human's, even a dead human's, and had been running ever since. The letter went on to list witnesses she was trying to locate, people who had been in the area that night, along with a request for a formal investigation. She was not hiding from justice. She was trying to find it, knowing that the odds of an orc receiving a fair hearing were slim, but apparently determined to try anyway. The other papers beneath the first letter were drafts, earlier attempts to tell her story, each one carefully worded, each one making the same plea for a chance to testify, to be heard, to present her side of what had happened. Quinlan was still holding the letters when he heard the footstep behind him, and he turned to find Grishka standing in the doorway, the bucket forgotten on the ground beside her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Her eyes, he noticed for the first time, were a startling amber color, bright against her green skin, and they were wide with the shock of finding a stranger in her home. Then her gaze dropped to the papers in his hand, and understanding flooded her features, followed immediately by resignation. "You are the bounty hunter," she said, and her voice was deeper than a human woman's but clear and steady. "I saw signs of someone tracking me 2 weeks ago but thought perhaps I had imagined it, or that you had given up." Quinlan slowly set the papers back on the table, keeping his hands visible and away from his weapons. "I do not give up," he said. "It is what makes me good at this work." She nodded slowly, and he saw her shoulders straighten, saw her visibly gather herself for whatever would come next. "Will you hear me speak before you bind me, or does it not matter to you whether the warrant is just?" The question struck harder than he expected, cutting straight to the doubt that had been growing in him throughout his long pursuit. "I have been a bounty hunter for 8 years," he said. "I have brought in 43 fugitives, and I have always told myself that justice is not my concern, only the capture. The courts decide guilt or innocence, not me. But you have doubts now." It was not a question. She took a step into the cabin, and Quinlan noted that she made no move toward any weapon, showed no intention of fighting or fleeing. "You would not be reading my letters if you were certain of my guilt." He could not argue with that. "Tell me what happened," he said. "Tell me the truth, and I will decide what to do with it." Grishka moved to the table and sat in one of the chairs, gesturing for him to take the other. He hesitated, then sat, angling himself so he could react if she tried anything, though his instincts were telling him that she would not. She folded her hands on the table in front of her, and he noticed that her nails were broken and dirt-stained from honest work, not the hands of someone who had spent 3 months idle. "I left my clan 6 months ago," she began. "We are not welcome among humans, as you know, but my clan's territory was becoming too crowded, and the elders said that some of the young ones would need to find new lands, or there would not be enough to sustain us through the winter. I volunteered to go, thinking that perhaps on the frontier there might be a place where an orc could live without constant conflict. I had some skill with plants and healing, learned from my mother, and I thought perhaps I could trade that knowledge for a chance at peace." She paused, and Quinlan saw the shadow of pain cross her features. "It was harder than I expected. Humans saw my face and my tusks, and they saw a monster, not a person. I could not find work, could not trade, could barely buy supplies even when I had coin to pay for them. I was hungry and desperate when I met Corin." "Corin?" Quinlan asked. "The orc boy," Grishka said. "He was alone, orphaned when his family was killed in a raid trying to survive on his own. He was stealing from Tobias Merchant's wagon when the man caught him. I heard the boy crying out and I went to see what was happening." Her hands tightened on the table. Merchant was beating him with a stick, hitting him again and again, and Corin was not fighting back, just curling up and trying to protect his head. I called out for the merchant to stop, tried to reason with him, but he ignored me. When I stepped forward to physically intervene, he turned on me instead. He said that orcs were animals, that we had no right to his mercy or his property, and he drew a knife. Quinlan listened without interrupting, watching her face as she spoke. He had interrogated enough liars to recognize the signs, the small tells that indicated fabrication, but he saw none of them in Grishka. She met his eyes steadily, her voice neither defensive nor pleading, simply recounting what had happened. "I did not want to hurt him," she continued. "I only wanted to get the knife away before he stabbed me or the boy." We struggled and he slipped, fell backward and struck his head on the wagon wheel. The sound it made, she stopped, closing her eyes briefly. I knew immediately that it was bad. I went to him, tried to help, but he was already dead. The boy was terrified, kept saying we would both be hanged for murder, that no one would believe it was an accident. He ran, and after a moment I ran too. You could have gone to the authorities, Quinlan said. Explained what happened. Grishka looked at him with something like pity. Could I? You are a human who has made a living capturing fugitives, who knows the law and how it works. Tell me honestly, bounty hunter, what do you think would have happened if an orc woman walked into a human town and said she had killed a human merchant in self-defense? He wanted to argue, to insist that the law was fair and would have heard her testimony, but he could not. He had seen too much prejudice, too many times when orcs and other non-human folk had been denied even basic justice simply because of what they were. The honest answer was that she would have been hanged or worse, and they both knew it. So you ran, he said. I ran, she agreed, but I am tired of running. This valley is remote enough that I hoped I might have some time before I was found, time to build a life and gather evidence, to find witnesses who might speak for me. I have been writing to magistrates, to advocates, to anyone who might listen, but so far there have been no replies. Perhaps there never will be. Perhaps I am a fool for hoping that an orc might receive justice in a human world. Quinlan sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the warrant in his pocket like a stone. 300 gold crowns. A new life. Everything he had been working toward for years. All he had to do was bind this woman, ignore the evidence that suggested her innocence, and deliver her to the people who wanted her dead. It would be easy, it would be profitable, it would make him sick with himself for the rest of his life. The boy, he said. Corin, do you know where he went? Grishka shook her head. He was heading south when I last saw him. I have tried to find word of him, thinking that if he could testify to what he saw, it might help my case, but there has been nothing. He is likely dead or too frightened to come forward even if he did survive. And Merchant's partner, the one who issued the warrant, did you know him? I had never seen him before the warrant was posted, Grishka said. But from what I learned later, he and Merchant had been partners for many years. Perhaps he genuinely believes I murdered his friend. Perhaps he simply wants revenge and does not care whether I am truly guilty. Quinlan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the valley bathed in the amber light of late afternoon. Behind him, he could hear Grishka breathing, steady and calm, waiting for him to make his decision. The logical choice was clear. He was a professional, and this was a job like any other. Personal feelings, doubts about justice, sympathy for the target, none of those things should matter when balanced against the contract he had accepted and the payment that waited. But he had not survived 8 years of dangerous work by ignoring his instincts, and every instinct he possessed was screaming that this warrant was wrong, that Grishka was telling the truth, that bringing her in would make him complicit in a murder far more deliberate than the accident she described. 3 months of tracking had shown him a woman who was trying to build a life, not a killer on the run. The evidence in her letters suggested someone seeking justice, not evading it. And the simple fact that she had not tried to run or fight when confronted told him more about her character than any warrant could. He turned back to face her, and she watched him with those amber eyes that held too much resignation, as if she had already accepted that hope was futile. That look decided him. Quinlan reached into his pocket and pulled out the warrant. Grishka tensed, clearly expecting him to use it to justify binding her wrists, but instead he walked to the hearth and fed the parchment into the flames. They both watched in silence as the fire consumed the document, curling the edges black and turning weeks of pursuit into ash. "What are you doing?" Grishka asked, and for the first time since he had met her, her voice shook. Something I should have done the moment I started having doubts, Quinlan said. That warrant is unjust, and I will not be party to your murder, because that is what delivering you would be. Murder, dressed up in legal paper and sealed with official wax. She stood slowly, staring at the flames as if unable to believe what she was seeing. But the bounty, your payment, means nothing if I cannot live with myself afterward, he said. I have done things I regret in my years as a bounty hunter, brought in people I suspected were innocent because I told myself it was not my place to judge. I will not do it again. Not for 300 gold crowns. Not for 3,000. Grishka crossed to the hearth and sank down onto the bench beside it, her legs seeming to give out beneath her. She put her face in her hands, and Quinlan realized with shock that she was crying, silent tears that slipped between her fingers and dropped onto the floor. He stood awkwardly, unsure what to do with this display of emotion, until she finally raised her head and looked at him with eyes that were red but clear. I did not think, she said slowly, that any human would choose justice over gold. I have been alone so long, running so long, that I had forgotten that kindness was even possible. The words struck him harder than any blow, revealing the depth of isolation and fear she had endured. You should not have had to run at all, he said. What happened to Merchant was an accident, and you were defending yourself and that boy. Any just court would see that. But courts are rarely just when it comes to my people, Grishka said. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. You have destroyed the warrant, but that does not mean I am safe. Merchant's partner can simply issue another, and another hunter will come. Quinlan had already considered that. Then we need to do what you have been trying to do. Find evidence, locate witnesses, build a case strong enough that even prejudice cannot ignore it. But you cannot do that alone, and you cannot do it while hiding in this valley. She looked at him with cautious hope. Are you offering to help me? He had not consciously made that decision until the words left his mouth, but as soon as he spoke them, he knew they were right. I am offering to help you find justice, he said. I have contacts, people who owe me favors, access to records and information that you could never get on your own. If witnesses exist, I can find them. If evidence remains, I can uncover it. And when we have enough to prove your innocence, I will stand with you before whatever court will hear your case. Grishka studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Why would you do this? You do not know me. My guilt or innocence should mean nothing to you beyond the loss of your payment. It was a fair question, and Quinlan found himself struggling to articulate an answer that he did not fully understand himself. Because I am tired, he finally said. Tired of hunting people for money. Tired of pretending that justice and law are the same thing. Tired of ignoring my conscience in favor of my purse. Perhaps this is my chance to do something that actually matters, to use my skills for something other than profit. Or perhaps I simply cannot stomach the thought of you hanging for a crime you did not commit. Does the reason matter as much as the result? I suppose not, she said softly. Then stronger, if you truly mean this, if you will help me seek justice, then I accept your offer. Though I have little to offer in return except my gratitude and whatever skills I possess. Your trust is payment enough, Quinlan said, and we should start planning immediately. The partner who issued the warrant will eventually learn that I found you and destroyed it. When he does, he will send others, perhaps multiple hunters, to ensure success. We have time, but not unlimited time. They spent the rest of the evening discussing strategy, sitting across from each other at the small table while darkness gathered outside the windows. Grishka made a simple meal of bread and stew, and they ate while talking through the details of the case. Quinlan questioned her closely about everything she remembered from that night, every small detail that might lead to evidence or witnesses. She answered with patience, clearly having reviewed the memories countless times already. When the boy Corin ran south, he would have needed shelter and food. Quinlan knew the settlements in that direction, knew which ones might take in an orc child and which would drive him away. If Corin had survived, there would be a trail, and trails were what Quinlan knew how to follow. Additionally, the trade road where Merchant had died was well traveled. There had to have been other people nearby, other merchants or travelers who might have seen or heard something useful. The fact that no witnesses had come forward for the original warrant suggested that no one had bothered to look for them, or had actively suppressed their testimony. As the night deepened and the fire burned low, Quinlan found himself watching Grishka with growing respect. She was intelligent and thoughtful, her mind quick to grasp the implications of various strategies. More than that, she possessed a quiet strength that he imagined had been tested brutally over the past months. Many people would have broken under the strain of being hunted, alone, denied even the basic dignity of a fair hearing. She had not only survived but had actively worked toward clearing her name, even when hope seemed impossible. "You should rest," she said finally, noticing him stifling a yawn. "You have traveled far to find me, and you must be exhausted." He was, bone-deep tired from months of pursuit and the emotional weight of the decision he had made. "I can make camp outside," he offered. "I have my bedroll and supplies." Grishka shook her head. "You have just burned 300 gold crowns to spare me from injustice. The least I can offer is a roof and a warm place to sleep. The bed is large enough for two if we are both respectful, or I can make a pallet on the floor." The suggestion was practical rather than improper, born of frontier sensibility where survival often required shared resources and trust. Quinlan hesitated, then nodded. "I will take the floor. You keep your bed." "I will not hear of it," she said firmly. "You are my guest. However unusual the circumstances of your arrival, I will make the pallet." They compromised, Quinlan insisting that he had slept rough for months and was perfectly comfortable on the floor, Grishka providing him with blankets and a pillow that smelled faintly of lavender. He lay awake for a long time after she had retired to her bed, listening to her breathing slow into sleep, and thinking about the path that had led him to this moment. 8 years as a bounty hunter, always telling himself that he was just doing a job, that morality was not his concern. It had taken meeting one orc woman, accused of a crime she did not commit, to show him how much of his own humanity he had been willing to trade for gold. Morning arrived with pale sunlight streaming through the cabin windows and the smell of cooking. Quinlan woke to find Grishka already up and preparing breakfast, moving quietly around the small space with practiced efficiency. They ate together, discussing the next steps of their plan. The first priority was to travel to the town where Merchant had been based, to investigate his business and his partner more thoroughly. If there was corruption or deception involved, that was the most likely place to find evidence of it. "It will be dangerous for you," Quinlan warned. "That town is where the warrant originated. If anyone recognizes you, then we will need to ensure I am not recognized," Grishka said calmly. "I can bind my tusks to make them less visible, wear a hood to shadow my face. My skin will still mark me as orc, but if I am with you, a known bounty hunter, people may assume I am your prisoner or your guide. Either way, they are less likely to question too closely." It was a risky plan, but Quinlan could not fault her logic. They would need to move carefully, gather information subtly, and avoid drawing attention until they had enough evidence to present a formal challenge to the warrant. He spent the morning helping Grishka secure her cabin for a potentially long absence, boarding up the windows and hiding her more valuable possessions. The chickens and goats would need to fend for themselves, released to the surrounding forest where they might find food and shelter. It was not ideal, but there was no other option. By midday they were ready to leave. Grishka had packed light, taking only what she could carry comfortably, and had wrapped her tusks with cloth that softened their outline without completely hiding them. A heavy cloak with a deep hood would serve to obscure her features when necessary. Quinlan checked his own gear, ensuring his weapons were ready and his supplies adequate for the journey ahead. The town they were heading for was 8 days' travel on foot, longer if they had to avoid settlements or detour around potential dangers. They walked in silence for the first few hours, each lost in their own thoughts. The valley gave way to wooded hills, and the path grew rougher, little more than a game trail winding between ancient trees. Quinlan found himself studying Grishka as they traveled, noting the way she moved through the forest with confidence and grace despite her size. She knew how to read the land, where to step to avoid noise, which plants were edible and which to avoid. These were not skills learned in a few months. This was knowledge passed down, taught with care and practiced over years. "Your mother taught you about healing plants," he said as they paused to refill their water skins at a stream. "Was she a healer for your clan?" Grishka nodded, kneeling by the water to cup her hands and drink. "She was our wisest medicine woman, and she tried to teach me everything she knew. I was a poor student at first, more interested in hunting and fighting than in herbs and poultices. But after my father was killed in a territorial dispute with another clan, I began to understand the value of her knowledge. Wounds that seemed minor could kill if infection set in. Illness could devastate a community if no one knew how to treat it. I started paying attention, and she was patient with my late learning. She would be proud of what you are trying to do," Quinlan said, "seeking justice instead of simply accepting injustice." "Perhaps," Grishka said quietly. "Or perhaps she would tell me I am a fool for believing justice is possible for someone like me." She had little love for humans, and with good reason. "Our lands have been encroached upon for generations, our people killed or driven away to make room for human settlements. The fact that I am even trying to prove my innocence in a human court would likely baffle her." Quinlan had no response to that, faced with the uncomfortable truth that her mother's prejudice would have been earned through bitter experience. They continued walking, and as the afternoon wore on, he found himself telling Grishka about his own past, stories he rarely shared with anyone. How he had become a bounty hunter after his family's farm failed, desperate for work that would let him survive. How his first capture had been a terrified young man who had stolen bread to feed his siblings, and how Quinlan had delivered him to the authorities and collected his payment without questioning whether it was right. How he had slowly hardened himself against doubt and sympathy, telling himself that he was just enforcing the law, that guilt or innocence was not his to determine. "But you never truly believed that," Grishka said when he finished, "or you would not have burned the warrant." "I wanted to believe it," Quinlan admitted. "It was easier than accepting that I might be doing harm for profit, but doubt has a way of accumulating, and eventually I could not ignore it anymore. Your case was simply the one that finally broke through my excuses." They made camp that night in a clearing that offered good visibility in all directions, essential for safety in the wilderness. Quinlan built a small fire while Grishka foraged nearby, returning with a collection of edible roots and mushrooms that she added to their rations. They ate together as stars emerged overhead, and Quinlan found himself enjoying her company in a way that surprised him. She was easy to talk to, thoughtful in her responses, and possessed a dry sense of humor that surfaced when he least expected it. "What will you do?" she asked as they sat watching the fire. "After this is resolved, I mean, will you return to bounty hunting?" Quinlan had been asking himself the same question. "I do not think I can," he said slowly. "Not after this. Even if we prove your innocence, even if justice is served, I do not think I could go back to hunting fugitives for gold. There are too many questions I would ask now, too many doubts I could not silence. Perhaps I will find other work, something that lets me use my skills without compromising my conscience." "You could stay," Grishka said quietly, not looking at him. "After this is finished, if we succeed in clearing my name, you could stay in the valley. It is isolated enough for safety but beautiful enough for a life. I had been thinking that if I survived this ordeal, I might try to build something there. A place where others like me, orcs who have been cast out or who seek peace away from clan conflicts, might find shelter. You would be welcome to be part of that." The offer caught him off guard, and he found himself considering it seriously instead of dismissing it out of hand. The idea of settling somewhere, of building instead of pursuing, held an appeal he had not expected. "Let us survive this first," he said. "Then we can talk about what comes after." She nodded, accepting his deflection, and they settled into their bedrolls. Quinlan took the first watch, sitting with his back against a tree and letting his eyes adjust to the darkness beyond the fire's glow. The forest was alive with night sounds, the rustle of small creatures, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through leaves. He found himself thinking about Grishka's offer, about what it would mean to leave bounty hunting behind and try to build something new. It was tempting, dangerously so, and he forced himself to focus on the present danger rather than hypothetical futures. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of travel and camp, walking until dusk, and then finding shelter for the night. They avoided settlements where possible, keeping to the wilderness paths that Grishka navigated with skill. Quinlan found himself learning from her, picking up knowledge about edible plants and animal signs, how to predict weather changes and find water in apparently dry country. She was a capable woodswoman, her clan training evident in every decision she made. As they traveled, Quinlan also found himself noticing other things about Grishka, details that had nothing to do with survival or justice. The way she would sometimes hum while walking, wordless melodies that were probably orc songs from her childhood. How her face would soften when she spoke about her mother or her clan, revealing the homesickness she usually kept hidden. The rare smile that would transform her features when something genuinely amused her, making her tusks flash in a way that was unexpectedly charming. He caught himself thinking about her more than was strictly professional, found his eyes drawn to her more often than was wise. On the 6th day of travel, they reached a river that marked the boundary of the territory where Merchant's Town lay. They needed to cross, but the water was running high from recent rains, the current strong enough to be dangerous. Quinlan studied the flow, calculating their chances, and decided they would need to find a better crossing point. They walked upstream for several hours before finding a place where the river widened and shallowed, running over a bed of stones that would provide better footing. "Stay close to me," Quinlan said as they prepared to cross. "The current is still strong, and the stones will be slippery." Grishka gave him a look that was part amusement, part exasperation. "I am Orc, bounty hunter. We are strong swimmers and sure-footed in rough terrain. I should be the one telling you to stay close." He had to acknowledge the fairness of that, and they entered the water together. The river was shockingly cold, fed by mountain snowmelt, and the current pulled at their legs with insistent force. Halfway across, Quinlan's foot slipped on a moss-covered stone and he stumbled, nearly going down. Grishka's hand shot out and caught his arm, her grip powerful and steady, holding him upright until he regained his balance. "Sure-footed," she said with the ghost of a smile, and he found himself laughing despite the cold and the danger. They made it across without further incident and paused on the far bank to wring out their clothing and catch their breath. Grishka's hood had fallen back during the crossing, revealing her face fully, and Quinlan found himself staring. Water droplets clung to her skin, catching the light, and her dark hair had come partly loose from its braid, falling in wet strands around her shoulders. She was beautiful, he realized with a start. Not in the way human women were beautiful, but with a strength and vitality that was entirely her own. The recognition unsettled him, raising questions he was not prepared to answer. "We should keep moving," he said, more abruptly than he intended. "We are close to the town now, and we need to find shelter before dark." If Grishka noticed his sudden awkwardness, she did not comment on it. They continued walking, entering a more settled area where farms dotted the landscape and roads became more established. They would need to be careful now to avoid drawing attention, especially once Grishka raised her hood again to shadow her features. As dusk approached, they found an abandoned barn on the edge of a fallow field, its roof partially collapsed, but offering enough shelter for the night. Inside, out of the wind, they made a cold camp without fire to avoid attracting notice. They ate dried meat and hard bread from their packs, washing it down with water from their skins. The barn smelled of old hay and weathered wood, not unpleasant, and mice rustled in the shadows. Quinlan spread his bedroll in a corner that still had solid roof overhead, and Grishka did the same nearby. "Tomorrow we enter the town," she said quietly. "What is your plan for investigating Merchant's partner?" "Carefully," Quinlan said. "I will make inquiries, present myself as a bounty hunter looking for information about a target. People are often willing to talk to me because they assume I am working for the law. You will need to stay hidden, at least initially. Once I have a sense of the situation and who we can trust, if anyone, then we can decide how to proceed." Grishka nodded slowly. "I do not like hiding while you take risks on my behalf, but I understand the necessity. My presence would only endanger us both if I am recognized." "We will clear your name," Quinlan said with more confidence than he felt. "We will find the truth and make sure it is heard." She looked at him in the dim light filtering through the broken roof, her amber eyes serious. "You have already risked so much for me, Quinlan. If we fail, if we cannot find enough evidence, or if the prejudice against my kind is too strong to overcome, I want you to know that I am grateful. You gave me hope when I had none, and that is a gift I can never repay." Hearing her speak his name, the gratitude in her voice, stirred something in his chest that he did not want to examine too closely. "We will not fail," he said firmly. "I have not come this far and sacrificed that bounty to give up now." They settled into silence, and eventually Quinlan heard Grishka's breathing deepen into sleep. He lay awake longer, thinking about the town they would enter tomorrow and all the things that could go wrong. Merchant's partner would likely be a respected citizen, someone with money and influence. Challenging him would mean challenging the power structure of the entire community. And if they failed, if Grishka was recognized and arrested, he would be complicit in hiding a fugitive. He could be charged as well, everything he had worked for destroyed. But when he thought about the alternative, about walking away and letting Grishka face injustice alone, he knew he could not do it. Somewhere in the past week of travel and conversation, of shared meals and mutual trust, she had become more than a fugitive whose warrant he had destroyed. She had become someone he cared about, someone whose welfare mattered to him in a way that went beyond professional obligation or moral duty. That realization should have frightened him. Instead, It settled over him like certainty, anchoring his resolve. Morning came too quickly, and they prepared to enter the town with careful attention to detail. Grishka wrapped her tusks again and pulled her hood low, hunching her shoulders to minimize her height. At a distance, in poor light, she might pass for human. Up close, the deception would not hold, which meant they needed to avoid close scrutiny. Quinlan coached her on how to move, to walk with less confidence and more deference, behaviors that would draw less attention in a human settlement. "I hate this," she muttered as they approached the outskirts of town. "Pretending to be less than I am, making myself small and timid." "I know," Quinlan said quietly, "and I hate asking it of you, but it is temporary just until we understand the situation better." The town was larger than Quinlan had expected, sprawling across both sides of a river with a stone bridge connecting them. Market stalls lined the main street, and the sound of commerce filled the air, vendors calling out their wares, wagons rattling over cobblestones, the general bustle of a prosperous settlement. Quinlan guided Grishka to a stable on the edge of town, paying for a stall and instructions to keep her presence quiet. She would wait there while he made his initial inquiries. "Be careful," she said as he prepared to leave. "If Merchant's partner is corrupt enough to issue a false warrant, he is dangerous." "I have dealt with dangerous men before," Quinlan assured her. "I will return before dark." He spent the morning moving through the town, listening to gossip and asking casual questions about Tobias Merchant and his partner, a man named Roland Pemberton. What he learned was illuminating and troubling in equal measure. Merchant and Pemberton had indeed been partners for many years, running a successful trading company that dealt in goods from the frontier territories. They had been respected members of the community, generous with local charities and active in town governance. But 6 months ago, shortly after Merchant's death, things had changed. Pemberton had become increasingly reclusive, focusing obsessively on finding the orc woman who had allegedly murdered his partner. He had spent considerable sums hiring bounty hunters, offering rewards, posting notices in surrounding territories. Some people thought it was grief driving him. Others whispered that there was something else going on, that Pemberton seemed more desperate than bereaved. Quinlan's instincts stirred. Desperate men made mistakes, and desperate men with something to hide often revealed more than they intended. He needed to meet Pemberton, to take his measure directly. Using his credentials as a bounty hunter, he arranged a meeting at Pemberton's office, a well-appointed room above a warehouse near the docks. Roland Pemberton was a thin man in his 50s with sharp features and calculating eyes. He greeted Quinlan with professional courtesy, offering a chair and asking what news he brought about the orc murderess. Quinlan spun a careful story, saying that he had tracked Grishka to the frontier but lost her trail in the wilderness. He was seeking additional information that might help him pick up the pursuit, details about the murder itself and about the victim. As he spoke, he watched Pemberton carefully. The man's reactions were revealing. When Quinlan mentioned investigating the crime scene, Pemberton became visibly agitated. When he suggested interviewing potential witnesses, Pemberton insisted there had been none, that the road had been empty except for Merchant and the orc. But Quinlan knew the trade road, knew that it was never truly empty during traveling season. There would have been witnesses. The question was why Pemberton was so determined to ensure they were never found. "What was Merchant carrying when he died?" Quinlan asked casually. "I need to know what might have been stolen in case the orc tried to sell it." Pemberton hesitated just a fraction too long before answering. "Standard trade goods, cloth, tools, some spices, nothing of exceptional value." It was a lie. Quinlan could see it in the way Pemberton's eyes shifted. the slight tension in his shoulders. Merchant had been carrying something valuable, something Pemberton did not want anyone to know about. The pieces were starting to come together in Quinlan's mind, forming a picture that was very different from the story the warrant told. "I will continue the search," Quinlan said, standing to leave. "If I find any trace of her, you will be the first to know." "See that you do," Pemberton said. "And remember, the warrant specifies alive or dead. If it comes to a choice, do not hesitate to choose dead. Justice must be served." The words confirmed what Quinlan had already suspected. Pemberton did not want Grishka brought in for trial. He wanted her silenced permanently, unable to testify about what had really happened that night. Whatever Merchant had been carrying, whatever secret Pemberton was protecting, it was worth killing to preserve. Quinlan left the office and spent the afternoon continuing his investigation, talking to people who had known Merchant, researching the business records that were publicly available. He learned that Merchant and Pemberton had been struggling financially before Merchant's death, their company on the verge of bankruptcy. But after the death, Pemberton had suddenly recovered, paying off debts and stabilizing the business. Where had the money come from? As evening approached, Quinlan returned to the stable where Grishka waited. He found her pacing in the stall, clearly anxious from the forced inactivity. When she saw him, relief flooded her features. "I was beginning to think something had happened to you," she said. "Nothing so dramatic," Quinlan assured her, "but I learned a great deal. We need to talk." He recounted everything he had discovered, watching Grishka's expression shift from hope to understanding to anger as the implications became clear. "He is protecting a secret," she said when he finished. "Something Merchant was carrying or doing that Pemberton does not want revealed, and I am the inconvenient witness who might expose it if I am allowed to testify." "Exactly," Quinlan said, "which means we need to find out what that secret is. If we can prove that Pemberton has a motive to silence you beyond simple justice for his partner, it will undermine the entire warrant." "How do we do that?" Grishka asked. "We cannot simply break into his office and search his records." Quinlan was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Actually," he said slowly, "that is exactly what we need to do, but carefully and with preparation. Pemberton keeps his business records in the warehouse office where I met with him today. If there is evidence of whatever scheme he and Merchant were running, it will be there." "That is incredibly dangerous," Grishka pointed out. "If we are caught, we will both hang." "Do you have a better idea?" Quinlan asked. "We need proof, and talk alone will not provide it. We need documents, numbers, something concrete that cannot be dismissed or explained away." Grishka considered, then nodded slowly. "Then we will do it." "When?" "Tonight," Quinlan said. "The warehouse will be empty and the town settles early. We wait until full dark, get in, find what we need, and get out. With luck, no one will even know we were there until we are long gone." They spent the remaining hours of daylight preparing. Quinlan purchased dark clothing and supplies they would need, including a pry bar for forcing locks and a hooded lantern that could be shuttered to control the light. As darkness fell over the town and honest folk retired to their homes, Quinlan and Grishka made their way through empty streets toward the warehouse district. The warehouse was a large building facing the river docks, its lower floor packed with crates and barrels, its upper floor housing the office. Quinlan had scouted the location earlier and knew there was a window on the office level that looked poorly secured. They approached from the riverside, moving through shadows and using the sound of the water to mask any noise. Getting to the window required climbing, and Grishka's strength proved invaluable. She boosted Quinlan up to the ledge, then pulled herself up with ease, her orc musculature making it look effortless. The window opened with minimal pressure from the pry bar, and they slipped inside, finding themselves in a dusty storage room adjacent to the main office. Quinlan unshuttered the lantern just enough to provide light, and they began their search. The office was well organized, ledgers lined up on shelves, correspondence filed in neat stacks. They worked quickly and methodically, Grishka searching the desk while Quinlan examined the ledgers. What they found exceeded even Quinlan's suspicions. The ledgers revealed that Merchant and Pemberton had been running an illegal operation, smuggling restricted goods across territorial borders and evading customs taxes. The profits had been substantial, but so had the risks. 6 months ago, shortly before Merchant's death, the operation had been on the verge of exposure. Customs inspectors had been asking questions, and Merchant had been scheduled to meet with authorities who suspected wrongdoing. Then Merchant had died, and all investigations had stopped. Pemberton had used the distraction of his partner's murder to destroy evidence and cover their tracks. The business had been restructured, the smuggling operation shut down, and the profits carefully laundered through legitimate transactions. And the only witness who could potentially connect Merchant to the illegal activity on the night he died was Grishka, who had seen him on the trade road, possibly carrying smuggled goods. "This is it," Quinlan whispered, holding up a ledger that detailed shipments and payments. "This proves Pemberton had motive to silence you. You could have testified about what Merchant was doing, where he was, what he might have been carrying. Even if you did not know the significance, your testimony would have raised questions that Pemberton could not afford to answer." Grishka was examining a stack of correspondence, and her face went pale. "Quinlan, look at this." She handed him a letter, and his blood ran cold as he read it. The letter was from Pemberton to a known criminal, dated a week after Merchant's death. It offered payment for eliminating an orc witness, describing Grishka in detail and providing information about her likely route of travel. Pemberton had not merely issued a warrant. He had hired assassins. "He tried to have you murdered," Quinlan said, rage building in his chest. "The warrant was just one approach. He also sent hired killers. And they failed," Grishka said quietly. "I was lucky. I moved fast enough, stayed ahead of pursuit, but others might not have been so fortunate." They gathered the most damning documents, including the ledgers and the letter, preparing to leave with the evidence that would destroy Pemberton and clear Grishka's name. But as Quinlan moved to extinguish the lantern, he heard voices from below. Someone had entered the warehouse. He and Grishka froze, listening. Multiple footsteps, the sound of men talking in low voices, then a shout of alarm as someone noticed the forced window. They had been discovered. "We need to leave now," Quinlan said, moving to the window, but Grishka grabbed his arm. "Listen," she whispered. The voices below were organizing, and Quinlan recognized the tone. These were not night watchmen stumbling upon a burglary. These were men who had been lying in wait, who had expected intruders. Pemberton had anticipated this possibility and set a trap. "The window is watched," Grishka said. "They are waiting for us to try to escape that way. We need another exit," Quinlan thought quickly, visualizing the warehouse layout. "The roof," he said. "There is a loading crane that extends over the water. If we can get to it and cross to the far side, we can drop to the docks and lose them in the riverside district." It was risky, but staying was certain capture. They moved quickly, finding a ladder that led to the roof access. Behind them, they could hear men climbing the stairs to the office level. Quinlan pushed open the roof hatch and pulled himself through, then reached down to help Grishka up. The night air was cold and damp from the river, and the warehouse roof was slick with moisture. The loading crane was a heavy wooden beam that projected over the water, used for hoisting cargo from boats to the warehouse. It was not designed to be crossed, but it was their only option. Quinlan stepped onto the beam, arms out for balance, moving carefully along the narrow surface. Behind him, Grishka followed, her greater weight making the beam creak ominously. Below them, men burst onto the roof, shouting when they saw the escaping figures. Quinlan heard the twang of a crossbow and felt the bolt whistle past his head. He moved faster, reaching the end of the crane arm and looking down at the water 6 feet below. Not a long drop, but the river was dark and the current strong. "Jump," he called to Grishka. "I will be right behind you." She did not hesitate, leaping from the crane and disappearing into the dark water with a splash. Quinlan followed a moment later, the cold shocking the breath from his lungs. The current caught him immediately, pulling him downstream, and he fought to keep his head above water while swimming for the far bank. Beside him, Grishka surfaced, her powerful strokes carrying her through the water more easily than his own. They reached the far bank 50 yards downstream from the warehouse, pulling themselves onto a small dock used by fishermen. Behind them, they could hear shouting and confusion, but the darkness and the river had covered their escape. They ran, dripping and freezing, into the maze of narrow streets that characterized the riverside district. Quinlan knew these areas, had hunted fugitives through similar warrants in a dozen different towns, and he used that knowledge now to lose their pursuers. They found shelter in an abandoned fish processing shed that reeked of old scales and brine but was dry and hidden from view. Grishka was shivering, her wet clothing clinging to her frame, and Quinlan realized he was shaking as well, more from cold than from fear. They had the evidence, the documents safely wrapped in oilcloth that had protected them from the water, but they were now fugitives themselves, hunted in a town where Pemberton had influence and resources. "We cannot stay here," Grishka said through chattering teeth. "Pemberton will have every street watched by morning. We need to get out of town while it is still dark." Quinlan agreed, but they needed to dry off first or risk freezing before they reached safety. He found some old canvas tarps in the corner of the shed, and they stripped off their wet outer layers, wrapping themselves in the musty but dry cloth. It was not ideal, but it would keep them warm enough to travel. As they huddled together for warmth, waiting for their clothing to dry enough to be wearable, Quinlan found himself acutely aware of Grishka's proximity. Even exhausted and cold, even in the midst of danger, he could not ignore the pull he felt toward her. When she leaned against him, sharing body heat, it felt natural and right in a way that defied all the prejudice and taboo he had been raised with. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything you have risked tonight and before. I know this has cost you far more than the bounty you burned." "It has given me far more than gold could buy," Quinlan found himself saying. "Purpose, meaning, maybe a chance at redemption for all the times I chose money over conscience." And he hesitated, then spoke the truth he had been avoiding. "It has given me you. Your trust, your companionship, your strength, that is worth more than any bounty." Grishka turned to look at him in the dim light filtering through cracks in the shed walls, her amber eyes searching his face. "Quinlan," she said softly, "are you saying what I think you are saying?" He should deny it, should step back from the edge of this admission, but he found he could not. "I care about you, Grishka. More than I should, more than is wise, but I cannot help it. Somewhere between burning that warrant and tonight's escape, you became essential to me. Not as a job or a cause, but as a person. He stopped, the final word too large and frightening to speak. "Love," she whispered. "Is that what you cannot say?" "I do not know," he admitted. "I have never felt anything like this before. But whatever it is real, and it terrifies me because I know how impossible it is. Human and orc, the prejudice alone would make any future together unthinkable. Add in the fact that you are still a fugitive, and I am now wanted for helping you, and the impossibility becomes absurd. Grishka reached out and took his hand, her grip strong and warm. Nothing about any of this has been possible, and yet here we are. You burned a warrant worth 300 gold crowns. We stole evidence from a corrupt merchant. We escaped armed men by jumping into a river. If we can do all of that, perhaps we can do the impossible thing of building a life together. You would want that? Quinlan asked. Despite everything, despite the difficulties it would bring. I have wanted it since you sat at my table and chose to believe my story instead of delivering me for execution, Grishka said. I have wanted it every day we traveled together, every night we made camp, every moment I saw you choose justice over profit and courage over safety. Yes, Quinlan Kelter, I would want that. I would want you if you would have me. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning and possibility. Quinlan knew he should be cautious, should think about all the reasons this was complicated and difficult. Instead, he leaned forward and kissed her, his lips meeting hers in a gesture that felt like coming home. Her tusks pressed gently against his face, an exotic sensation that was part of what made her who she was. Her lips were soft and warm, and she kissed him back with a hunger that matched his own. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the cold of the night had been forgotten entirely. We need to survive this first, Quinlan said, resting his forehead against hers. We need to clear your name and expose Pemberton. But after that, if you still want me, I will build that life with you, in your valley or anywhere else, as long as we are together. Then let us survive, Grishka said fiercely. Let us win this fight and claim the future we deserve. They dressed in their still damp clothing and slipped out of the shed while darkness still held. The town was stirring with unusual activity, searchers moving through the streets with torches, but Quinlan and Grishka moved like shadows, avoiding detection through skill and luck. They reached the eastern edge of town, as dawn was beginning to gray the sky, and struck out into the farmland beyond, putting distance between themselves and pursuit. For 3 days they traveled hard, avoiding roads and settlements, living on foraged food and water from streams. Behind them, Quinlan knew that Pemberton would be organizing a manhunt, spreading word of the escaped fugitive and her accomplice. But ahead of them lay their destination, the territorial capital, where the magistrate who governed this region held court. It was their only hope of presenting the evidence in a forum where it might be fairly heard. The capital was a week's journey from Pemberton's town, and they pushed themselves to make it in 5, knowing that every hour counted. When the city walls finally came into view, stone and mortar rising against the horizon, Quinlan felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. This was where they would make their stand, where everything would be decided. But entering the capital presented its own challenges. Grishka could not hide her orc nature in a crowded city, and if Pemberton had sent word ahead, they might be arrested on sight. They needed an advocate, someone with standing and influence who could present their case to the magistrate and ensure they received a fair hearing. Quinlan knew of one person who might help, a lawyer named Silas Merrick, who had a reputation for taking difficult cases and fighting for unpopular causes. Years ago, Quinlan had helped Merrick prove the innocence of a client by tracking down a key witness, and the lawyer had said he owed Quinlan a debt. It was time to call that debt in. They found Merrick's office in the legal district, a modest building wedged between larger, grander establishments. Quinlan sent Grishka to wait in a nearby alley while he went inside, knowing that springing an orc client on Merrick without warning would not help their cause. The lawyer was older now, his hair more gray than brown, but his eyes were still sharp and his handshake still firm. "Quinlan Kelter," Merrick said, surprise evident in his voice. I had not expected to see you again. What brings you to my office? I need your help, Quinlan said bluntly. I have a client who is innocent of the crime she is accused of, and I have evidence that proves it. But she is an orc, and the man who wants her dead is wealthy and influential. Without a skilled advocate, she will never receive a fair hearing. Marek's eyebrows rose. You are asking me to represent an orc in a murder case. Quinlan, you know what that would mean for my reputation, for my practice. I would lose half my clients simply for agreeing to it. I know what I am asking, Quinlan said, and I know you have made a career of taking cases that others will not touch. This woman saved a child from being beaten to death and was forced to defend herself when the attacker turned on her. She has been hunted for months for a crime that was, at worst, an accident in self-defense, and at best completely justified. The man who issued the warrant did so not for justice, but to protect his own criminal enterprises. I have proof of all of this, but it will mean nothing if we cannot get it before a magistrate who will actually listen. Marek studied him for a long moment. You believe in her innocence that strongly. I burned a 300 gold crown warrant to keep her from being wrongly executed, Quinlan said. I risked my life to steal evidence from the man who wants her dead. Yes, I believe in her innocence. More than that, I believe in her. She deserves justice, and I am asking you to help me get it for her. The lawyer was quiet, considering. Then he nodded slowly. Bring her in. Let me meet this client you believe in so deeply. If her story matches your passion, I will take the case. Quinlan retrieved Grishka from the alley, and she entered the office with her head high despite her obvious nervousness. Marek stared for a moment, clearly taken aback by her size and her obvious orcish features, but he gestured for her to sit and listened as she told her story. Quinlan watched the lawyer's face as Grishka spoke, saw the moment when professional skepticism gave way to belief. When she finished, Marek asked to see the evidence they had stolen. Quinlan laid out the ledgers and the letter, walking the lawyer through what they had discovered about Pemberton's smuggling operation and his attempts to silence Grishka. Marek examined each document carefully, his legal mind clearly assessing the strength of the case. This is damning, he said finally. If we can get this before the magistrate, and if we can find the boy Corin to testify to what he witnessed, we have a strong case. Not just for proving your innocence, Grishka, but for bringing charges against Pemberton for conspiracy and attempted murder. Can you get us that hearing? Quinlan asked. Pemberton has influence and he will fight this. He does have influence, Marek agreed. But the territorial magistrate, Marcus Harrow, is famously incorruptible. If we can get your case on his docket, he will hear it fairly. The challenge is keeping you both alive and free long enough to make that happen. Pemberton will have people in this city, and if he learns you are here, he will move against you. They spent the rest of the day planning their strategy. Marek would file a petition with the magistrate's court, requesting a formal hearing on the warrant issued for Grishka's arrest. He would present the evidence of Pemberton's corruption and argue that the warrant was issued in bad faith. Meanwhile, Quinlan would continue his search for Corin, the orc boy who had been the original victim and who could provide eyewitness testimony to what had actually happened. Finding Corin would not be easy. 3 months had passed, and the boy could be anywhere. But Quinlan had contacts in the orc communities, people he had dealt with over his years as a bounty hunter. Some of them hated him, seeing him as a traitor who hunted his own kind for human gold. But others respected his fairness, the fact that he had always been honest in his dealings and never cruel in his captures. He would need to call on those contacts now, and hope they would help for Grishka's sake if not for his. Marek arranged for them to stay in a safe house, a small apartment owned by a client who owed him favors. It was in a quiet neighborhood where an orc woman would draw less attention, close enough to the legal district for convenience, but far enough for some safety. They settled in, knowing that the next few days would determine everything. Quinlan spent those days searching, moving through the parts of the city where orcs and other non-human folk congregated, asking careful questions about a young orc male who might have arrived 3 months ago, alone and frightened. He encountered suspicion and hostility, but also occasional cooperation from those who recognized his description of Corin, or who had heard rumors of a lone boy matching his age and appearance. The breakthrough came on the 4th day, when an elderly orc woman told him about a boy who had been taken in by a family living on the city's outskirts. The description matched, and Quinlan felt hope surge as he made his way to the address she provided. The dwelling was modest, a small house with a garden, and when he knocked, a middle-aged orc male answered, his expression immediately wary at the sight of a human. "I am looking for a young orc named Corin," Quinlan said carefully. "I mean him no harm. I am trying to help a woman named Grishka who saved his life 3 months ago on the northern trade road." The wariness did not fade, but the door opened a little wider. Why would a human want to help an orc woman? Because she is innocent of the crime she is accused of, and because she deserves justice, Quinlan said. "Corin is the witness who can prove what really happened. I need to speak with him." There was a long pause, then the door opened fully. "Come in. But know that if you mean harm to the boy, you will not leave this house alive." Quinlan entered and found himself in a warm, comfortable home. Sitting at the table, looking thin and haunted but alive, was Corin. The boy stared at Quinlan with wide, fearful eyes, and Quinlan raised his hands to show he was unarmed. "I am a friend of Grishka's," he said gently. "She told me what happened, how you were being beaten, and she tried to help. I need you to tell me your story, Corin. I need you to testify about what you saw that night." The boy looked at the couple who had taken him in, clearly seeking their guidance. The woman, who had been standing in the kitchen, came forward and placed a protective hand on his shoulder. "You do not have to do anything you do not want to do," she told Corin. "But if this man is truly trying to help Grishka, then perhaps you should speak." Slowly, haltingly, Corin told his story. It matched Grishka's account in every detail. He had been stealing food because he was starving. Merchant had caught him and begun beating him viciously. Grishka had intervened, tried to stop the violence, and Merchant had attacked her with a knife. In the struggle, the merchant had fallen and died. Corin had panicked and run, and he had been running ever since, until this family had taken him in and given him shelter. "Will you testify to this in court?" Quinlan asked when the boy finished. "Will you stand before the magistrate and tell him what you saw?" Corin trembled, clearly terrified at the prospect. "They will not believe me. I am orc. Humans do not listen to our words." "Magistrate Harrow will listen," Quinlan said. "He is known for his fairness, and you will not be alone. Grishka will be there, and I will be there, and we have a lawyer who will make sure your testimony is heard. But we need you, Corin. Without your witness, Grishka might be convicted of a murder that was not murder at all." The boy looked at his foster parents again, and the woman nodded slightly. "Be brave, little one. Grishka was brave for you when she stepped between you and that human stick. Now you can be brave for her." Corin drew a deep breath and nodded. "I will testify. I owe her my life. I will speak the truth, even if no one believes me." Quinlan felt relief wash over him. They had their witness. Combined with the documentary evidence of Pemberton's corruption, they had a case that could actually win. He thanked the family and arranged for Corin to come to the magistrate's court on the day of the hearing, promising that he would be protected and that his testimony mattered. When he returned to the safe house and told Grishka the news, She actually cried, tears of relief and hope streaming down her face. "He is alive," she whispered. "I have worried about him every day since that night, wondered if he survived, if he found safety. Knowing he is well, that he has a family who cares for him, that matters as much as his testimony." The hearing was scheduled for 2 days later, and Merrick used that time to prepare them for what to expect. The magistrate would question them directly, as would any representative Pemberton chose to send. They would need to be clear, consistent, and unshakable in their testimony. Merrick would present the documentary evidence and call Corrin as a witness, but ultimately the decision would rest with Magistrate Harrow. "There is one more thing you should know," Merrick told them the night before the hearing. "Pemberton has arrived in the city. He is claiming that you assaulted him and stole from him, and he is demanding that you both be arrested immediately. I have managed to delay any action until after the hearing, but he will be there, and he will fight this with everything he has." "Let him come," Grishka said, her voice hard. "Let him face me and repeat his lies while I stand before him. I am done running, done hiding. Tomorrow we end this one way or another." That night, Quinlan and Grishka lay together in the small bedroom of the safe house, holding each other close. They did not speak of the possibility of failure, of what might happen if the magistrate ruled against them. Instead, they focused on the present, on the warmth of each other's presence and the strength they drew from being together. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Grishka whispered in the darkness, "know that you have given me something I thought I had lost forever. Hope. The belief that justice might actually exist, that kindness is not just a foolish dream. You have given me that, and I will be grateful for it all my life, however long or short that may be." "We are going to win," Quinlan said fiercely. "We have the truth on our side, and we have evidence, and we have each other. Pemberton is the one who should be afraid, not us." Morning came too quickly, and they dressed in the best clothing Merrick had been able to provide for them. Grishka looked regal in a simple dress of dark blue, her hair braided and her tusks visible but cleaned and polished. Quinlan wore the formal attire of a professional bounty hunter, projecting competence and respectability. Together, they walked to the magistrate's court, Merrick leading the way and young Corrin following with his foster parents. The courtroom was smaller than Quinlan had expected, a wood-paneled chamber with benches for observers and a raised platform where Magistrate Harrow would sit in judgment. Pemberton was already there, surrounded by his own lawyers, and when he saw Grishka his face twisted with rage. "That is her," he shouted. "That is the orc murderess. Arrest her immediately, Magistrate Harrow." A stern man with gray hair and sharp eyes struck his gavel. "You will be silent, Mr. Pemberton, or I will have you removed from this court. This is a formal hearing and order will be maintained." Pemberton subsided, but his glare remained fixed on Grishka. The magistrate called the court to order and invited Merrick to present his case. The lawyer stood and began to lay out the evidence systematically. He introduced the ledgers that proved Pemberton and Merchant had been running an illegal smuggling operation. He presented the letter that showed Pemberton had hired assassins to kill Grishka. He called Corrin to testify, and the boy told his story in a clear, steady voice that grew stronger as he spoke. Quinlan watched the magistrate's face as the case unfolded, and he saw the moment when Harrow's expression shifted from judicial neutrality to genuine interest. This was not a simple matter of an orc killing a human. This was a complex web of crime and corruption, and the magistrate was too skilled not to see it. When it was Pemberton's turn to present his defense, his lawyers tried to discredit Corrin's testimony, suggesting that an orc child was not a reliable witness. They attempted to explain away the ledgers as innocent business records that had been misinterpreted. They claimed the letter about hiring assassins was a forgery. But Merrick countered each point with precision, demonstrating the authenticity of the documents and the consistency of the testimony. Finally, the magistrate called Grishka to testify. She stood before him with dignity, her head high and her voice steady as she recounted the events of that night. She did not try to minimize what had happened or excuse her actions. She simply told the truth, that she had tried to stop a man from beating a child to death, and that when he attacked her, she had defended herself. "Did you intend to kill Tobias Merchant?" Magistrate Harrow asked. "No, sir," Grishka said clearly. "I intended only to disarm him and stop the violence. His death was an accident, one I have regretted every day since it happened. And yet you fled instead of reporting the incident to the authorities." "Why?" Grishka met his eyes steadily. "Because I am orc, sir. Because I knew that no one would believe my word over a human's, especially a dead human's. Because I had seen too many of my people hanged or worse for crimes they did not commit, simply because of what they are. I fled because I feared I would not receive justice, and everything that has happened since suggests that fear was well-founded." The magistrate was quiet for a long moment, considering. Then he turned to Pemberton. "Mr. Pemberton, do you have any explanation for these ledgers that document illegal smuggling activities? For the letter arranging the assassination of a witness?" Pemberton's face had gone pale. "Those documents are forgeries, Your Honor. This bounty hunter and this orc broke into my office and stole them, then fabricated evidence to support their lies. Then you will not mind if I order an audit of your business records," Harrow said, "and an investigation into your activities over the past year. If these documents are indeed forgeries, that investigation will exonerate you. If they are authentic, it will confirm your guilt." Pemberton's lawyers began to protest, but the magistrate silenced them with a look. "I have heard enough," Harrow said. "It is the judgment of this court that the warrant issued for the arrest of Grishka of the Northern clans is void and unenforceable. The evidence suggests that her actions on the night in question constituted lawful self-defense and defense of another. Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate investigation of Roland Pemberton for smuggling, corruption, and conspiracy to commit murder. Mr. Pemberton, you are remanded to custody pending that investigation." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Pemberton's lawyers were shouting objections while guards moved to take him into custody. Pemberton himself was raging, screaming accusations and threats, but the magistrate ignored him. Harrow stood and approached Grishka, who was standing frozen in shock. "You have been through an ordeal no one should endure," the magistrate said quietly. "I cannot undo the injustice you have suffered, but I can ensure it goes no further. You are free, Grishka. The charges against you are dismissed, and you have the full protection of this court from any further persecution." Grishka's legs seemed to give out, and Quinlan caught her, holding her steady as she processed what had just happened. They had won. Against all odds, against prejudice and corruption and power, they had won. Justice, that abstract concept that had seemed so impossible, had actually prevailed. Merrick was shaking Quinlan's hand, congratulating him on the outcome. Corin was being embraced by his foster parents, crying with relief, and Grishka was in Quinlan's arms, holding him so tightly he could barely breathe, her own tears soaking into his shirt. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." "You did it," Quinlan corrected. "You never gave up, never stopped fighting for justice even when it seemed hopeless. I just helped you reach the finish line." They stayed in the city for another week while the formalities were completed and the investigation into Pemberton proceeded. The evidence they had uncovered led to additional charges, and it became clear that Pemberton would spend the rest of his life in prison. Quinlan testified again, this time as a witness against the man who had beaten him, and the boy's courage impressed everyone who saw him speak. During that week, Quinlan and Grishka talked about their future. The valley where she had built her cabin still called to them both, remote enough for safety but beautiful enough for happiness. Quinlan had no desire to return to bounty hunting, and Grishka's dream of creating a place where orcs and other outcasts might find peace seemed more possible now than ever. "We could build something real there," Grishka said as they sat together in a park, watching the city bustle around them. "A community, a refuge, somewhere that people like Quinlan could go when they have nowhere else, somewhere that humans and orcs could learn to live together without fear or prejudice." "It will be hard work," Quinlan said. "There will be resistance, people who oppose the very idea of it. But I cannot think of anything I would rather do than build that with you." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, no longer caring who might see or what they might think. They had faced down injustice, and won. They had proven that truth could triumph over lies, that courage could overcome fear, and that love could bridge even the deepest divides. What did the disapproval of strangers matter compared to that? On their last day in the city, they visited Quinlan and his family. The boy had blossomed in the weeks since his testimony, the haunted look fading from his eyes as he began to believe he was truly safe. His foster parents had formally adopted him, giving him the family and home he had lost. When Grishka hugged him goodbye, Quinlan saw the bond between them, forged in violence but tempered into something strong and enduring. "If you ever need anything," Grishka told the boy, "if you ever want to visit or if you need help, you send word to the valley. We will always have a place for you." Quinlan promised he would, and Quinlan knew the boy meant it. They said their farewells and began the long journey back to the valley, back to the cabin that waited for them and the life they would build together. The walk took 2 weeks, but neither of them minded. They were in no hurry, content to travel at an easy pace and enjoy each other's company. The valley was as beautiful as Quinlan remembered, the mountains rising on either side and the river running clear through the center. Grishka's cabin stood where she had left it, weathered by her absence but still sound. They spent the first few days repairing the damage from months of neglect, replacing broken shingles and clearing out animals that had taken up residence in the barn. As they worked, they talked about their plans. The cabin would need to be expanded if they hoped to shelter others in addition to themselves. They would need to plant more extensive gardens, raise more livestock, create infrastructure for a growing community. It was daunting, but it was also exciting, the promise of building something meaningful from nothing. Quinlan used his remaining savings to purchase supplies and tools, making several trips to the nearest settlement to haul back lumber and hardware. Grishka proved to be a skilled builder, her strength making quick work of tasks that would have taken Quinlan days. Together, they constructed an addition to the cabin, a large common room that could serve as a gathering space for the community they hoped to build. Word began to spread, carried by travelers and traders, about the valley where an orc woman and a human man had built a refuge for those rejected by prejudice. Slowly, cautiously, people began to arrive. First, an elderly orc woman whose clan had cast her out for being too old to contribute. Then a half-orc child whose human parent had died and whose orc parent wanted nothing to do with her. A human man who had been crippled in a farming accident and could no longer work, rejected by his family as a burden. Grishka and Quinlan welcomed them all, asking no questions about their pasts and demanding only that they contribute what they could to the community. The elderly orc woman proved to be a skilled weaver, teaching the others her craft. The half-orc child was bright and curious, helping in the gardens and learning healing arts from Grishka. The crippled man had been a blacksmith before his injury, and his knowledge of metalwork proved invaluable for maintaining tools and creating new ones. As the months passed and the community grew, Quinlan found himself happier than he had ever been. The work was hard, the challenges constant, but it was work that mattered. Every person they helped, every life they improved, felt like redemption for the years he had spent hunting fugitives without questioning whether justice was truly being served. And through it all, at the center of everything, was Grishka. She was the heart of the community, the one everyone turned to for guidance and comfort. But for Quinlan, she was so much more. She was his partner in every sense, the person he turned to when things were difficult, and the one he wanted to celebrate with when things went well. She challenged him, supported him, loved him with a fierceness that still sometimes took his breath away. On a spring morning 1 year after the trial, Quinlan woke to find Grishka already up and standing at the window, looking out over the valley. They had 14 people living in the community now, with plans to build additional cabins to house more. The gardens were flourishing, the livestock healthy and multiplying. It was everything they had dreamed of and more. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "I am thinking about how impossible this all seemed," she said softly. "A year ago I was alone and hunted, certain I would die without ever knowing justice or peace. And now I have both, along with a home and a family and you. It feels like a dream sometimes, like I will wake up and find myself back in that cabin, still running, still afraid." "It is not a dream," Quinlan said, taking her hand. "It is real and it is ours, and it is only going to grow from here." She turned to face him, her amber eyes bright. "Quinlan Kelter, human bounty hunter who burned a warrant and changed everything, I have a question for you." "Ask it," he said. "Will you marry me?" Grishka said. "I know it is not traditional for the woman to ask, and I know that a marriage between orc and human is almost unheard of, but I do not care about tradition or what others think. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life building this dream with you. Will you have me as your wife?" Quinlan felt tears sting his eyes, overwhelmed by the simple courage it took for her to ask, by the depth of feeling in her voice. "Yes," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you, Grishka. I cannot imagine my life without you in it." They married a month later, in a ceremony that blended human and orc traditions. The entire community attended, along with Corin and his family who traveled from the city to witness it. There was no magistrate or priest to officiate, but Marek had sent documentation recognizing their union as legal and binding. They spoke their vows to each other under the open sky, promising love and loyalty and partnership for all the years they had remaining. The celebration lasted into the night, with food and music and laughter echoing through the valley. Quinlan danced with his wife, marveling at how far they had come from that day he had stood in the forest, watching her hang laundry and struggling with the decision to burn a warrant. That choice had led to all of this: a community, a purpose, a love that defied every expectation and prejudice. As the fire burned low and the guests began to retire to their beds, Quinlan and Grishka stood together looking out at the valley bathed in moonlight. The future stretched before them, full of challenges and uncertainties, but also full of promise. They had proven that change was possible, that justice could triumph, and that love could overcome even the deepest divisions. "I would burn that warrant again," Quinlan said quietly. "1,000 times over without hesitation." "I know you would," Grishka said, leaning against him. "And I would trust you again, 1,000 times over with my life and my heart." They stood there together, husband and wife, human and orc, Two people who had defied the odds and built something beautiful from the ashes of injustice. The valley would continue to grow, the community would continue to thrive, and their love would continue to be the foundation upon which it all stood. It was not the ending Quinlan had imagined when he had first become a bounty hunter, but it was infinitely better than anything he could have dreamed. The warrant was ash, scattered to the winds months ago. But what had risen from those ashes was worth more than all the gold in the world, and Quinlan knew with absolute certainty that he had made the right choice. He had tracked the orc woman for months, and when he found her, he had burned the warrant. And in doing so, he had found not just justice for her, but redemption for himself and a future for them both. Years would pass, and the community in the valley would become known throughout the frontier as a place of refuge and hope. Quinlan and Grishka would welcome hundreds of outcasts and wanderers, building a society where human and orc and all manner of folk could live together in peace. They would face challenges and opposition, but they would face them together, their bond unbreakable. And on quiet evenings when the work was done and the community was at rest, they would sit together and remember that long-ago day when a bounty hunter tracked an orc woman for months, and when he finally found her, he chose justice over gold, love over duty, and in doing so, changed both their lives forever. It was a story worth telling, a story worth living, and a story that would echo through the valley for generations to come, a testament to the power of courage, compassion, and the choice to do what was right even when it cost everything.